Yeah, this summer, Apple newly introduced iPhone mirroring. That means that is a feature that allows users to remote control their locked iPhone wireless from their Mac. And how does this feature work? Um, okay, I don't want to anticipate too much. Um, Aaron will give you a deep dive into this feature. And I'm really excited what he has to tell us. So please welcome the fabulous Aaron.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and also thank you all for being here at this early time while many of you are still waiting in queue outside. Yes, I want to take the next half hour to talk a bit about this new iPhone mirroring feature that Apple introduced. Maybe before I get started, let me tell you a few words of who I am. Oh, well, that skipped a bit too far forwards, but I can still tell you that. I'm Aaron. I'm a cybersecurity master's student at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam. And I have also been a security researcher at Jiska Claessen's chair for around the past 6 to 10 months, where I looked into things like Apple continuity, this whole Apple ecosystem, and in particular iPhone mirroring when it was introduced. And how did this whole story start? Basically, Apple held their annual Worldwide Developer Conference in May, I think, and basically directly after that keynote presentation, Jiska sent me an email with like, hey, this is a very interesting feature. It looks very weird from a security perspective. You are remote controlling your iPhone while it is supposedly locked, but maybe not really. And it looks like you're controlling like a virtual machine, but it's actually your iPhone. And like the iPhone should be locked, but it isn't. It's just a very weird thing. So maybe this might be interesting to look at. And that is when I started. And well, arguably it was quite interesting to look at. And what I found is what I want to tell you today. So for those of you who generally don't use the Apple ecosystem, let's maybe take a look at how this feature is supposed to work. Basically, you have your iPhone, it is locked, and you have your Mac, and it has that window up there, which is basically your iPhone. You can click on it, you can interact with it, you can open apps, you can look at your photos, do whatever you want, apart from a few limitations that I will go into in just a second. What is somewhat interesting about this is the fact that there are a few awareness features when people are using this feature. You've seen the first one right there, which is that there's a permanent notification on the lock screen of the iPhone while you're remote controlling that device. And also, after you unlock that iPhone afterwards, there's this pull notification up top that shows you, yeah, well, there has been a connection since you last unlocked this iPhone. And if you tap on it, it also shows you a list of which devices were connected, and you get that whole history, and it's supposed to be very transparent and all that. So let's maybe take a look at how this actually works, like from a security perspective, but also just out of, well, what protocols are they using, to then later take a look at how we might be able to break this stuff. And the foundation for all of this is Apple's continuity framework, which is a name for a number of features that all somewhat work differently. But what this has quite a lot of similarities to is Apple Sidecar, which is when you use your iPad as a second screen for your MacBook, and continuity camera, where you can use your iPhone or your iPad as a camera for your Mac, for your Apple TV, whatever. And also, I've put AirDrop in here, even though it's technically not Apple continuity, but it actually works the same, while other features just use plain Bluetooth. And what is used here is these two protocols, like a lot of abbreviations, but let's look at what they actually are. First of all, there is Apple Wireless Direct Link, which is Apple's proprietary thing for making devices talk to each other over Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. The idea essentially is that they find themselves among each other via Bluetooth or energy, and after they found each other, they establish a Wi-Fi peer-to-peer connection, which then allows you to transfer data at relatively high data rates. And this is used in the context of iPhone mirroring to transfer your mouse input, your keyboard input, and other control commands that you send from your Mac. But Apple Wireless Direct Link isn't really suitable for live video streaming, and Apple has their own proprietary protocol for that as well, which works over Wi-Fi. They call it low latency Wi-Fi, and it is what they use for the media data, so video and audio. Interestingly, this is basically the same thing that you would use when using Apple Sidecar, but just in reverse. So here it's the iPhone sending video to your Mac, whereas with Apple Sidecar, it's the Mac sending video to your iPad, and for the control data the other way around, which was quite interesting. So you might wonder, well, how does this actually work in terms of security and protection? And I personally found this quite interesting and also a pretty nice solution actually, and that is that Apple performs key management for this, which means that every Apple device that you have generates its public-private key pair and then syncs that to your iCloud keychain, and these public keys are then synced among all of your devices that are signed into your Apple ID, which allows them to find each other even though they're offline, and they can just interact with that, and you don't need any internet connection doing that, but it's still secure, and you can basically perform a key exchange and it works. Okay, after having talked about how this feature is supposed to work and how it works from a technical perspective, the next topic that came quite apparent that it needed to be discussed was the threat model, because, as I said, it's just a very weird feature.
So,
what does Apple tell us what it's supposed to do?
What's on my iPhone screen while I'm using iPhone mirroring? It stays locked, so nobody else can access it.
So this is basically what Apple told us. This is just a short extract from that Worldwide Developer Conference keynote presentation. The iPhone is supposed to stay locked, but is it actually? Because if we take a look at it, okay, well, on the lock screen it says it is locked. It actually has that lock icon on there. But at the same time, you've seen that picture already, we are interacting with that iPhone as though it was unlocked. So it's definitely not really locked. It's just some weird state in between. And, well, that is just a very weird thing to have, and also opened the question of what exactly is this supposed to protect against, and what threats are they considering, and what is out of scope, what is in scope. And that is what I wanted to take a look at. And as I said, this video is basically all that Apple told us about what the threat model here is supposed to be. So what we already saw is that, okay, the iPhone is supposed to be locked and you cannot access anything on the iPhone while you're remote controlling it. And also, it is supposed to be obvious that this remote control connection is established. There are a few more things that Apple limits, which is stuff like no camera and no microphone access from your Mac while you're remote controlling the iPhone. And also the fact that you cannot change certain settings, such as you cannot change the PIN or the biometrics authentication methods on the iPhone while you're remote controlling it. And from that, I tried to derive what the threat model here actually is, and I came to two main points, which is that, first of all, the iPhones are supposed to remain secure while they are being remote controlled, and they might be in another room, they might be in a pocket, somebody might be able to get them in their hands while you're remote controlling it. And also, especially with these red things that I mentioned, it appears that Apple is aware of the fact that it is relatively likely that in situations where multiple people might be using a Mac in all kinds of social situations, it is realistic that the iPhone might in fact get remote controlled by someone who is actually not supposed to do that, and it should be apparent to the user, and it should at least prevent some of the issues that might happen. And based off of that is what I looked into when I did security research. And one of these topics was, well, macOS is a very interesting attack surface, because previously, when you had your iPhone, the only way to do much with it was while holding that device in your hand, and there isn't really much that you can do when you just connect it to a Mac via USB or anything. It's basically limited to what you can do because it is already synced into your iCloud account if you enabled that. So things like photos and contacts might be shared, but you cannot just install applications or anything like that. And in general, macOS is a less secure platform in the sense that it is a far more open platform. For example, you can at least run unsigned software, and you can also disable security features that are just the default on iPhones and cannot be disabled unless you jailbreak them or have a security research device. And so there is a high risk for malware and abuse in macOS. And with iPhone mirroring, this basically enables a direct path from a compromise of the macOS operating system to a compromise of the iPhone, because, as we already saw, we are now controlling iPhones from the Mac. And one idea that I had what one could do here is basically play around with these AWDL keys that I mentioned a few minutes ago and just swap them around. The idea behind this being that I already mentioned we have this list of previously connected devices, and maybe we might be able to spoof which device appears when we connect from a different device, because maybe somehow the iPhone confuses the different devices if we swap around keys. How might this key swapping work? Well, we need one or multiple Macs that have a number of security features, namely system integrity protection disabled, which allows us to access these keys from software that we are able to write. And in particular, I used Frida, which is a dynamic reverse engineering tool, which allows you to hook functions that are run anywhere in the system, and you can modify their input values, their output values, and their behavior. And what I did is just hook these functions that are supposed to perform this whole key authentication stuff, and then extract the keys on one Mac and put them into another Mac, and then try what happens. And what I found is that it is actually relatively well implemented, because first of all, I can swap around keys from two Macs signed into the same Apple ID, of which one is not paired to the iPhone, and no matter which keys you use, the mirroring feature still works. But also, you cannot just swap around keys to make a non-authenticated Mac suddenly work. So from that perspective, it is fine. And why might that be? Well, I don't entirely know, honestly. Likely this is due to the fact that they are putting additional security measures into the hardware security modules that they have in the Macs. So they might have additional key material there that they store in a hardware module that you just cannot access from software directly. This is especially likely because Apple mentions the existence of such a hardware security module as a system requirement for this iPhone mirroring feature. So you cannot just use any old Mac, but you need one that has like an Apple T1 or T2 chip. But reverse engineering that software is actually incredibly hard because, first of all, the firmware for these chips is relatively hardware dependent for the different device generations, and also it just comes without symbols. It is generally not really available in binary form, so it's just a lot of work that I didn't have the time to just look into that. So this is what the security likely comes from, but I couldn't prove that yet. Okay, let's now move on to the fun stuff, which is, well, where did this all go wrong? And where did people make implementation mistakes? Maybe just as a word before, well, just to notice, this whole feature is, of course, incredibly complex, and also making sure that the security guarantees that I mentioned beforehand are actually applied in all parts of the system is an incredibly complex task. So that mistakes are made here was quite likely, and which is also why I found some. And I like to call them Schrödinger's iPhone because, again, it's about this whole weird thing with it's locked and it's not locked, and in which situation does that application consider to be and when doesn't it. So let's look at the first implementation issues in just a second. Before that, let's look at how they actually implemented all of this and what impact iPhone mirroring has when you're using the iPhone. Again, this is an example I already told you about a moment ago, which is that you cannot change your Touch ID and passcode. So in this case, it's an iPhone with a fingerprint sensor, but it could also be Face ID. You can change these settings while you're remote controlling the iPhone. And apparently, the settings app seems to be aware of the fact that the iPhone is being remote controlled, but we should keep in mind that Apple currently does not provide any public API to developers to check whether the iPhone is currently in such a state. So these system applications are the only ones who are capable of actually checking. So this was the first vulnerability I found and that I actually reported to Apple, which is working with Siri. And what I show here is that if I tell Siri to take a screenshot and send an iMessage message to someone from that screenshot from the locked iPhone, well, it just doesn't work and it asks me for my fingerprint for authentication. But if I now connect to that iPhone via iPhone mirroring, well, let's try that again and ask that question again. And we will see in just a second that the iPhone will just take that screenshot. And also, if we continue all of this, actually send it to someone. And remember, this iPhone is supposed to be locked, as we were told in the keynote presentation. And does this clicker won't work? Yes. This was the fact in the second beta of iOS 18, so not a fully public release. And apart from not only sending messages, the arguably far worse part was the fact that you could also ask Siri to read out any iMessage messages from any user that you had received before, and it would just happily do so. I reported that in July, and Apple actually ultimately fixed it, so it was already completed when the final release of iOS 18 came out in September. And we can see here, yeah, luckily it is resolved, although it was ultimately, at least for me, marked as a duplicate report, because apparently multiple people had reported it at the same time. Next up, this whole topic of camera and microphone access, and this is where it actually becomes quite a lot more interesting. Because when you try to access the camera or the microphone of a of the iPhone from your Mac, you get this dialog right here, which tells you, yeah, you cannot do this, and you can just press OK, and after that, nothing happens. And just to remember, well, in general, iPhone apps just cannot know that the iPhone is being remote controlled. So I wondered what happens if I take a photo instead. Well, this happens, and no, this is not a placeholder. This is actually the picture that you get. So it appears that Apple seems to be quite keen on preventing this feature from working, even though it's not really cleanly implemented. And I presume that it is supposed to be there for preventing people from spying on other people where the iPhone might be in another room. So this would at least justify why it is so hastily implemented that it just prints out a green image and that there is no public API to check for anyone or anything. Okay, so this doesn't work. Well, can we basically make the iPhone work as a spy device anyways? And the idea I had was using Apple Shortcuts, which is their automation tool. If you've never used these before, you can just basically create programs in a drag and drop interface. And what I basically did is create a shortcut that waits for a few seconds, that then starts a recording, waits some more time, stops that recording, and then sends it to someone or just syncs it to the iCloud. The idea being that if I disconnect from the iPhone, while this 10-second delay is running, when that check is performed whether I can access the camera or microphone, I'm not connected anymore and it just runs. What also works, apart from just making recordings, is just initiating FaceTime calls, which is far more awesome because I basically get a direct video and audio live feed from that device. What else could I want more if I want to use this device as a bug? And, well, Apple told me that this is supposed to be expected behavior. Well, that's what they initially told me. When I rechecked this, when I prepared this presentation, funnily enough, I found that this issue is in fact fixed. The solution here is that all shortcuts are interrupted whenever you disconnect from iPhone mirroring, which is like a very stringent and maybe a bit too harsh solution for this problem, but it works. So this is why I'm also very happy to talk about it now, because again, this issue just doesn't work anymore. They just terminate all your shortcuts that are running, and in that way, you cannot start any actions that then gain permissions from when you disconnect. So that is fixed, luckily. Okay, another topic I want to look at is persisting and hiding access. What do I mean by that? iPhone mirroring access is temporary and evident, which I've hopefully already shown you. Just to recap in a few screenshots. I clicked too many buttons right here. There we go. There we go. Basically, you need to re-enter your PIN on the iPhone every few days, maybe. I don't entirely know what the conditions for that are. So you cannot just continuously remote control the iPhone from anywhere. And again, we have these notifications for current past connections, and we have this list of recent connections. So these are the security features that Apple provides, and so let's take a look at what we might be able to break from this. First off, let's take a look at normal operation on how these notifications are supposed to work. For those of you who have not seen that feature in action before, this is now your chance to see it in video. I'm basically just performing a normal connection and disconnecting from the iPhone. And in a second, we will see that when I take that iPhone into my hand, we see that that permanent notification has disappeared, and the notification pops up, and if I click on it, it opens the list of previously connected Macs. Okay, so far so good, this works. But let's try another thing, because we have access to these iPhone mirroring settings while we're remote controlling the iPhone. And if we do so, and just open the settings app right here, then we can go ahead and go to AirPlay and Continuity and open that iPhone mirroring settings page, and just delete the Mac we're currently connected from, so it doesn't appear anymore in that list. And well, it terminates our connection, but if we now take a look at the iPhone, we will see that, well, there still is a notification after we unlock it, but if we click on that notification, well, even that menu item about iPhone mirroring at all doesn't exist anymore. So anyone who would see that feature, who would see that notification, might be able to click on it, never see it again, and have no idea what actually happened, even though the iPhone was just compromised and somebody has done basically anything with it. And again, I reported this to Apple, and what I was told is that this is not even a security topic at all. Interesting. Okay, let's look at gaining persistence, so to not only gain that, temporary access while we're remote controlling the device. And there is a number of ways to do this. First of all, you could do things like add Bluetooth devices. Arguably, if you're already signed into the same Apple ID, some of the Apple devices basically sync their Bluetooth pairing over the iCloud anyways, but at the same time, you can use this feature to pair any Bluetooth devices that might be used to maybe randomly initiate FaceTime calls and similar things. And I reported some of these things to Apple and was basically told, yeah, these are features, these are supposed to be here. So at some point, I basically stopped to report every feature that this whole system has as a bug, because apparently, well, it's wanted, but I think, especially as a security-conscious crowd here, you should be aware of these things. We can, of course, also pair new Wi-Fi networks and then sniff Wi-Fi traffic. And what we are also able to is install applications and give permissions. And depending on what applications you might have in mind here, it might be used for permanent location tracking, always uploading photos. You might just basically use normal apps to just misuse them in a completely different setting, which could, of course, be very problematic. Okay, as a last major topic, let's look at stolen device protection, which is a feature that some of you may have heard of. It has been introduced after devices were stolen, especially in the US, after these thieves had observed people entering their PINs, which enabled these thieves to basically change far more things than just have that iPhone in their hand, and do things like make payments using the paired credit cards, also apply for an Apple credit card and make purchases with that in the terms of tens of thousands of dollars. And also do things like changing the iCloud password, because for those of you who don't know, you can change your iCloud password with just your iPhone and its PIN for some reason. And you can also do things like yeah, that's basically the main features, and there's a number of security things. You cannot change the PIN of the device and so on and so forth. And what this stolen device protection does is it introduces biometrics as the highest security form of authentication. So you need biometrics to perform an iCloud password change, and you need biometrics to access locked and hidden apps, which is also a feature that has been newly introduced in iOS 18. Further security features that come with this, well, this whole iPhone rebooting thing that you may have heard of, that Jiska did some research into this fall, where the iPhone reboots when it has not been unlocked for 72 hours might be tied to the stolen device protection. And also what stolen device protection introduces is a so-called security delay, which means you have to authenticate if you want to do something, then wait another hour, and then authenticate again to then access these security critical settings, so that just someone having the iPhone in their hand and making you put their finger in it or holding it in front of your face, that just is supposed to not have any major impact. So that's the idea behind this. And to take a look at, from a more graphical perspective, what this does to the threat model, if we don't use stolen device protection, basically we have our PIN and our biometrics, and these three things that I'm showing below are unlocking the device, changing the iCloud password, and accessing hidden and locked apps. And if we don't use stolen device protection, we can use any of the two to do any of the three. So that is perfectly fine. But if we start using stolen device protection, this changes a bit, and we can only use the PIN to unlock the iPhone, and we need biometrics for the two other things. But if we now do enable stolen device protection and look at that in combination with iPhone mirroring, it becomes far more interesting. Because if we have another Mac that is signed into the same Apple ID, we only need the PIN to pair the iPhone to that Mac, which then for some reason allows us to access these hidden and locked apps, which I again found quite weird and reported to Apple, and was told, well, again, this is supposed to be expected behavior. And well, one could say, yes, it doesn't say otherwise, because this is the dialog that is shown to you when you try to enable this feature, and it tells you, require Touch ID to access this app. And then in the description it says, require Touch ID or the passcode. And this description text does not change whether or not you're using stolen device protection. But yeah, I would say it's at least unclear if you expect that feature to work because you've tried it out, and it just suddenly doesn't work anymore, and it's just unexpected. Okay, let me conclude. All in all, I think I've shown you that iPhone mirroring is a very complex and also unprecedented feature, both in the Apple ecosystem and also in other mobile device ecosystems, because it's just so incredibly weird to have a locked device that can be remote controlled at the same time, and it has an incredibly complex threat model that I tried to understand, but I think that is not really understood yet by anyone. Next up, Apple tried to introduce a number of safeguards to protect this whole feature, which were successful in some parts and required some refinements in other parts. These initial implementations that they rolled out in these beta programs had pretty critical bugs, things like that Siri feature. This threat model is definitely not implemented consistently, and I would also argue that app developers themselves need to be taken into account when we're doing all of this, because they should also consider whether they want a certain feature of the apps to be available while the iPhone is being remote controlled or not. And maybe 3 last things of what I would maybe wish from Apple is, first of all, to define what this threat model is actually supposed to protect against, because we as security researchers basically don't know. We have to write reports and then be basically told that this is expected behavior or not, and we cannot really know beforehand. Next up, protect some more critical resources. So maybe consider whether it is a good idea that I can give permanent permissions to things while the iPhone is being remote controlled, that I can install apps while it's being remote controlled. Maybe this is a feature that just isn't needed, maybe. And also lastly, and you might have maybe heard my cynicism from some of these reports, maybe properly assess reports that are reported to you when they are actually reported, and not at a later point when for some reason they are fixed 6 months later, because maybe there is things that are far more complex that you might not be looking into, and it would be nice if, well, these were considered. And with that, thank you very much for being here. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Thank you, Aaron. That was really, really interesting. I have an iPhone, and maybe I should not get a Mac.
I mean, you can. It's just a question of whether you want to enable that feature or not.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the question and answer section. And do you have questions to Aaron? I can pass you the microphone and...
I can just pass the microphone.
Is the camera itself, the camera feature itself locked, or just the camera app? So can I open a third-party app and access the camera through it?
No, the feature is in fact completely locked, and it also just shows that notification anywhere, which also was the main reason why I wondered what happens if I basically access the camera anyways. And this green thing is basically what you get in every app when you take a photo. And the preview generally doesn't work, but if it performs like taking an actual picture, you always just get that green image.
It's the same thing with the microphone and everything?
Yes, in that case, you basically just get silence.
Maybe I missed the first 2 minutes of the talk, but on the topic of what is an expected feature and what isn't, what is the actual purpose? So what are you supposed to do with that feature, and what are you not supposed to do?
That is exactly the question. Like what they show you, what you're supposed to do is things that, like, they also sync your notifications, and the idea is that you can click on the iPhone notification and that window pops up and you can interact with that notification in the native iPhone app. That is one of the features that they show you, but what is not supposed to work is something that you just don't define, and what I tried to find out, but have honestly not really found a final conclusion.
Okay, I think that were all the questions. Really, really, really interesting talk. I will have to rewatch that when it's published. Thank you all for coming here, and please give a warm, final, big applause to Aaron.